Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it is a profound honor to stand before you today in South Africa, on this soil that has known both the horrors of violence and the triumph of liberation. It was not too long ago that the world watched as apartheid, a system designed to strip people of their dignity, was dismantled. Today, we are called to dismantle a similar, though different system of denial and silence, one that renders countless male targets of domestic violence invisible. We are indeed gathered here to expand a narrative that has been essential for justice but incomplete. Domestic violence is not new in South Africa. After the horrors of apartheid, our society was determined to eradicate every form of oppression and violence. This determination led to the 1998 Domestic Violence Act, which sought to protect victims and build a safer South Africa. Yet, while this law recognized the suffering of women and children, it left one important truth unspoken. Men too are targets of domestic violence. Despite this reality, men were excluded from domestic violence surveys, as seen in South Africa 2016 Domestic Violence Report. Today, I am here not to diminish the real and painful experiences of female survivors. On the contrary, this book complements the fight against violence in all its forms. It acknowledges that the frameworks we use today, the power and control wheel, and the cycle of abuse came from brave women who shared their stories and fought for change. But if our goal is a society free from violence, we cannot fight half the battle. We must acknowledge that violence has no gender. The denial of male victimization has consequences, not just for men, but for families and broader society. In South Africa, the Moshet Foundation alone receives 30 complaints from male targets every month. Given that men are often reluctant to report their abuse, the true number can be far higher. Yet, many studies reveal that law enforcement is reluctant to investigate male complaints, despite male and female victimization occurring at comparable rates. This silence and neglect affects us all. When male victimization goes ignored, it feeds into what has been described by many institutions as the epidemic of fatherlessness, and the cost is staggering. Consider these statistics in South Africa. 63% of suicides, 70% of juvenile offenders, 80% of sexual offenders, 85% of children with behavioral problems, and 90% of runaway children all come from fatherless homes. How can we continue to deny the importance of recognizing male victimization in domestic violence? The longer we allow this denial to continue, the deeper these wounds will run and the more lives will be lost. South Africa has a proud legacy of standing against injustice. When Nelson Mandela took the oath of office in 1994, he embodied the hopes of a nation that has endured the atrocities of apartheid. Despite experiencing profound violence, Mandela championed peace, accountability, and national healing. His approach mirrors the resilience of domestic violence survivors who strive to break the cycle of violence, not only against themselves, but for others as well. In contrast, perpetrators perpetrate harm using excuses and manipulation to evade accountability. Mandela once said, "Racism is taught, and because it is taught, it can be untaught." Today, I come before you to say, so too is sexism. The stereotypes that deny male victimization are not natural truths. They are learned behaviors, and because they are learned, they can be challenged, unlearned, and also dismantled. As a young boy growing up in Cameroon in the 80s and 90s, I witnessed the struggle against apartheid from afar. My parents even took in South African refugees, and I learned early on to show compassion to anyone experiencing violence regardless of their identity. This is the same compassion we need today. A compassion that extends to all victims of violence, whether male or female, black or white. Just as South Africa could not achieve justice by excluding any part of its population, we cannot achieve true equality by ignoring male targets of domestic violence. The fight against apartheid was not just for black South Africans. It was a fight for the dignity of all humanity. In the same way, recognizing male victimization does not detract from female survivors. It strengthens the fight against domestic violence for everyone. The framing of domestic violence as a gender issue has limited our ability to confront it fully. But violence is not a gender issue. It is a human issue. Male targets of abuse react like anyone else. They fight in self-defense, flee for safety, or freeze in confusion. These reactions are not evidence of aggression, as they are often portrayed, but signs that these men need safety, support, and healing. Being here in South Africa, I believe you can all better understand how dangerous it can be when our responses to oppression are further used as excuses to perpetrate violence. When Mandela fought back, he was imprisoned. Ruth first fled. She was assassinated. When children and youth even froze in confusion, they were massacred. The streets of Soweto. Regardless of their responses, the oppressors mischaracterized them as aggressors, paving the way for further violence to come their way. When it comes to male victimization in domestic violence, sadly, this is the reality for many men. Racism, like sexism, must be dismantled. The age of denial of male victimization must come to an end, as apartheid once did. But how can we end this denial when we do not recognize the experiences of men? Apartheid could only be dismantled when we showed compassion, not denial, and when those primarily affected by violence were included, not excluded. History bears it out that it's rather the courage of oppressed communities that have always been instrumental in ending violence, not only for themselves, but for others. When it comes to domestic violence, this is equally true. To drive home this point, consider this excerpt from the book. I read, "Despite pervasive stereotypes that label survivors of domestic violence as weak, incapable of making decisions, or responsible for their own victimization, the reality is that both male and female survivors have been at the forefront of transforming societal responses to abuse. From the development of the power and control wheel to the advocacy of figures like Earl Silverman and Tammy Weisenberg, survivors have reshaped how we understand and address domestic violence. Their resilience serves as a testament to the power of human courage in challenging violence and fostering change. While stigma affects all survivors, male survivors face heightened level of shame and isolation, particularly in cases of sexual victimization. These men are often denied recognition as legitimate targets of domestic violence, facing a greater societal reluctance to accept their experiences. This imbalance deepens the injustice, but also highlights the urgent need to dismantle all forms of stigma against both men and women if we are to build a society where peace and support prevails. The actions of survivors, regardless of gender, work towards stopping abuse, not only for themselves but for others as well. Their efforts contribute to making the world a more just and peaceful place. A pursuit that requires strength, not weakness. In contrast, it is the perpetrators of violence, the architects of oppression and harm, who ought to carry the burden of shame and guilt. Giselle Pelicot, who chose a public trial over a private one, exemplifies this mindset. Open quote. I wanted all women who are rape victims to say to themselves, Mrs. Pelicot did it, so we can do it too. It's not us who should feel shame, but them, the perpetrators. End quote. The path to a more peaceful world lies in believing survivors, supporting them without prejudice, and recognizing the transformative role they play in promoting security and dignity for all. Far from being incapable of making informed decisions, survivors embody the power to reshape society, guiding us towards a future free from abuse. Their strength inspires us to replace judgment with empathy, denial with understanding, and shame with pride, ensuring that every victim who speaks out becomes a catalyst for change. End reading. The book we launched today in South Africa, Behind Closed Doors, is not just about the pain of male survivors. It is about breaking the silence. It tells the stories of men who have been dismissed, stigmatized, and denied justice. And it also calls us to expand our support services to include male targets, just as female survivors have been supported for decades. When Mandela took the oath of office, I was still a boy then, watching the swearing-in ceremony on television with my now elderly father. Early on, I could learn how our compassion, not denial, eventually led to that moment. The moment marked the beginning of a new era, an era where never again shall the responses of any target of violence be mischaracterized as an excuse for further violence to come their way. In my wildest imagination, I never thought I would have the honor to be here today, advocating for such principles to be expanded from race to gender when it comes to domestic violence. South Africa has already shown that change is possible. Just as apartheid was dismantled, we can dismantle the stereotypes that prevent the recognition of male victimization. Through restorative justice, we can offer healing for victims, accountability for perpetrators, and safety for communities, just as we did with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after apartheid. But before we can heal, we must first acknowledge. For male targets of domestic violence, The journey towards healing has not even begun because their pain is still denied. It is time to end this denial. Just as we collected data and documented the experiences of women, we must now start collecting data on male victimization to inform policies and services. It is ironic that those who are often victimized, those who are marginalized and oppressed, are the ones who lead us towards justice. The South Africans who fought apartheid, the enslaved Africans who resisted colonization, Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, and the courageous women of Duluth who gave us the power and control wheel. All of them showed us that equality isn't a gift, but a hard-won achievement. The same applies to male victimization in domestic violence. Their stories are invaluable, their experiences essential to the fight against violence. We must listen to these men, not dismiss or reject them. Violence is a personal choice. It is not random, as we often think, and it is not justified by the identity of the perpetrator. Abusers must be held accountable, and all victims, male, female, black, white, must be shown compassion. As my parents taught me, through their kindness to refugees, compassion must not be limited to identity. It must extend to all who experience violence. I'm truly honored to be here today to share in the history of this great nation. Just as South Africa fought against the injustices of apartheid, we now stand at the threshold of a new fight. The fight to end the denial of male victimization. The power to create change is in our hands. I invite you to read Behind Closed Doors, share its message, and join this movement to expand the conversation. Together, we can build a world where no victim is invisible, where no form of violence is tolerated, and where justice and equality are available to all, regardless of gender. This is our mandate. Thank you all for listening.